"Why did you bring your paralyzed kid here?" single mum said on a blind date. The CEO smiled. The soft glow of chandeliers cast long shadows across the polished mahogany of the elegant restaurant, a sanctuary of hushed conversations and the gentle clinking of silverware. It was a place for whispered secrets and budding romances, not the quiet hum of a child's motorized wheelchair. Arthur navigated the narrow path between tables with a practiced grace, his hand resting reassuringly on the shoulder of his son, Leo. The boy, small for his age, but with eyes that held a universe of wisdom, clutched a worn sketchbook to his chest, his gaze fixed on the intricate patterns of the velvet wallpaper. For Arthur, this wasn't just another blind date arranged by a well-meaning friend. It was a profound, unspoken test of the human heart. He was searching for a connection that went deeper than superficial pleasantries, a spark of genuine empathy in a world that often looked away. Arthur settled Leo at their reserved table, ensuring his son had a clear view of the room and was comfortable. He didn't fuss or overcompensate. His movements were fluid and full of a father's quiet, unconditional love. He adjusted the small blanket over Leo's legs, sharing a secret smile with the boy that spoke volumes of their shared journey. To any onlooker, they were simply a father and son, a portrait of devotion that seemed both out of place and perfectly natural. Arthur was a man who commanded boardrooms and navigated complex corporate mergers. Yet here, his entire world was distilled into the well-being of the bright, inquisitive child beside him. He wasn't playing a role, he was living his most authentic truth, purposefully placing his vulnerability on display as the ultimate litmus test for a stranger's soul. Clara arrived precisely 7 minutes late, a gust of hurried energy disrupting the restaurant's serene atmosphere. She wore a dress that had seen better days, meticulously ironed to mask its age, and her face was a canvas of carefully applied makeup that couldn't quite hide the exhaustion etched around her eyes. Her gaze swept the room, searching until it landed on Arthur. A flicker of relief crossed her features, quickly extinguished as she noticed the wheelchair. Her steps faltered for a fraction of a second, her polite smile tightening at the edges. It was a micro-expression, a momentary lapse in her composure. But for Arthur, who was watching intently, it was as loud as a scream. He saw the calculation in her eyes, the swift, silent judgment that categorized his son not as a person, but as a complication. "You must be Arthur," she said, her voice a little too bright, a little too forced. She extended a hand, her grip brief and cool. Arthur stood, his smile warm and genuine as he introduced his co-pilot for the evening. "And this is my amazing son, Leo." Clara offered the boy a cursory nod, her eyes barely meeting his, before she turned her full attention back to Arthur, her body language creating an invisible wall between herself and the child. The initial conversation was a stilted dance of pleasantries, each question she posed about his work and his life, carefully avoiding the most obvious subject in the room. The silence wasn't just a lack of words. It was heavy with unspoken questions and the palpable weight of her disapproval, a chill that no amount of polite chatter could warm. As the waiter retreated after taking their drink orders, the pretense of casual conversation crumbled, leaving a raw, uncomfortable silence in its wake. Arthur watched Clara as she methodically straightened her silverware, her knuckles white. He could see the storm brewing behind her carefully guarded expression, the frustration of a single mother on a rare night out, confronted with a situation she neither expected nor wanted. He had intentionally orchestrated this moment, this uncomfortable collision of his world with hers, believing it was the only way to find the authenticity he craved. He knew it was a risk, a gamble that could end in bitterness and misunderstanding. But he hadn't yet grasped the full depth of the chasm that separated them. Nor did he realize that her impending words would become the very key that would either lock a door forever or open a new destiny. The question hung in the air, sharp and cold. a shard of glass in the warm, velvet atmosphere of the restaurant. "Why did you bring your paralyzed kid here?" Clara's words, born of a frustration she could no longer contain, echoed in the space between them. For a fleeting moment, a fierce, protective fire ignited in Arthur's chest. His first instinct was to rise, to shield his son with a wall of indignation, to match her cruelty with his own cold fury. But then he looked at Leo. The boy had flinched, his small shoulders pulling inward as if to disappear. His gaze was fixed on a blank page in his sketchbook, his crayon held motionless. In that instant, Arthur saw not an insult to be avenged, but a wound to be soothed. He made a choice, a conscious decision to swallow the bitter taste of anger and respond not from his own pride, but from the depths of his fatherly love. His conscience guided him toward a more difficult path. Instead of seeing an adversary across the table, he forced himself to truly see Clara. He noticed the slight tremble in her hand as she reached for her water glass, the desperate hope that had been in her eyes when she first arrived, now curdled into bitter disappointment. He saw a woman worn down by life, a single mother whose own struggles had built a fortress around her heart, leaving little room for anyone else's burdens. Her question, though brutal in its delivery, was a cry from her own world of scarcity and hardship. It was the voice of someone who saw another's perceived complication as a threat to her own fragile chance at relief. Arthur knew that responding with anger would be easy, righteous even, but it would also be a dead end. His heart told him there was a greater lesson to be found in this painful moment. Taking a slow, deliberate breath, Arthur reached across the table and gently covered Leo's hand with his own, a silent message of unwavering support that flowed between them. He then met Clara's challenging gaze, not with condemnation, but with a profound and disarming sadness. "I brought Leo," he began, his voice calm and even, a stark contrast to the emotional storm she had unleashed, "because he is the center of my world. He is not a footnote in my life story. He is the main character alongside me. We are a team." He paused, letting the simple truth of his words settle. "I brought him because his laughter is the best sound I know, and because his perspective on the world from that chair has taught me more about strength and grace than any boardroom ever could. He is my son. Where I go, he goes." Clara's rigid posture seemed to deflate, the sharp edges of her anger softening into confusion. She had been braced for a fight, for a defensive retort that would validate her frustration. She was prepared for him to storm out, to call her heartless, to end the disastrous evening with a dramatic flourish. But this quiet, unwavering sincerity was a language she didn't know how to speak. It was a response that didn't attack her, but instead gently dismantled her entire premise. Her gaze flickered from Arthur's calm, open face to the small boy who was now cautiously looking up from his sketchbook, his wide, intelligent eyes holding not fear, but a quiet curiosity. The invisible wall she had erected between herself and the child began to crumble, brick by painful brick, under the weight of Arthur's simple, profound love. With a gentle but resolute finality, Arthur made his decision. The test was over. The results clear. The quiet, knowing smile that had been forming in his mind now touched his lips, a look of somber understanding rather than victory. It was a smile that acknowledged the sad truth of the situation, the chasm of empathy that separated their two worlds. He saw her not as a monster, but as a tragic figure who had failed a test she didn't even know she was taking. He subtly raised his hand, catching the eye of the distant waiter. The gesture was small, almost imperceptible, but it was a definitive action. He was bringing this charade to a close, not with a heated argument, but with the quiet dignity the situation demanded, leaving Clara suspended in the uncomfortable silence, a dawning awareness flickering in her eyes that she had just lost something far more important than a second date. The brief, sterile exchange with Clara concluded as Arthur settled the bill. his movements calm and deliberate, a stark contrast to the emotional tempest inside. He guided Leo's wheelchair away from the table without a single backward glance, leaving the woman suspended in her own harsh judgment. Once outside, the cool night air felt like a balm, washing over them and cleansing the residue of the encounter. A sudden, unexpected drizzle began to fall, dotting the pavement with dark circles that grew and merged into a slick sheen. Leo was unusually quiet. His head bowed over his sketchbook, the silence between father and son heavy with unspoken questions. Arthur placed a reassuring hand on his son's shoulder, a silent promise that the world's cruelty could never break the fortress of their love. They were a team, a fact that no amount of ignorance could ever change. As they moved toward the parking garage, a figure huddled in the recessed doorway of a closed shop caught Arthur's eye. For a fleeting moment, the cynicism from the evening threatened to take hold. It would be so much simpler to walk past, to retreat into the warmth and safety of their car and leave the world's troubles behind. But then he saw Leo looking, his son's gaze not filled with pity or fear, but with a simple, profound curiosity. In that small, upturned face, Arthur saw a reflection of his own better nature. He steered the wheelchair towards the doorway, his umbrella a small shield against the increasing rain. The figure was a young woman, shivering slightly, clutching a large, battered art portfolio as if it were a life raft. When she looked up, her eyes were wide and startled, but held a resilience that was both surprising and admirable. She was clearly drenched and trying to protect her work from the encroaching dampness, a silent battle against the elements. Arthur simply extended the umbrella, offering its shelter without a word. The woman's defensive posture softened as she took in the sight of the kind-faced man and the small boy beside him. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice raspy from the cold. Leo, sensing the tension break, pushed his sketchbook forward, pointing to a half-finished drawing of a dragon breathing gentle, colorful flowers instead of fire. The woman's face broke into the first genuine smile Arthur had seen all evening, a radiant expression that lit up the dim alley. "I'm Sarah," she offered, her gaze lingering on the boy's artwork. "That's beautiful." The simple, heartfelt compliment was directed entirely at Leo, acknowledging him not as an accessory or a problem, but as a creator, a person worthy of attention and respect. It was a small moment, yet it felt monumental. Sensing an opportunity to extend the kindness, Arthur suggested a nearby all-night cafe. "Let's get you a warm drink on us, to protect the portfolio," he added with a gentle smile, making it about her work rather than her plight. After a moment of hesitation, Sarah agreed. Seated in a warm booth, a sense of life returned to her face. She spoke with a quiet passion about her dream of creating art programs for community centers, of using creativity as a tool for healing and connection for children who had little else. Her vision was so aligned with the core mission of his new foundation that it felt like fate. Yet, when Arthur gently probed about what had left her stranded in the rain, a shadow crossed her face. She vaguely mentioned a disagreement with a landlord and a sudden change of plans, leaving the details shrouded in a quiet, dignified mystery. As they prepared to leave, Arthur pulled out a business card, not his corporate one, but a simple card for the Leo's Light Foundation, an entity so new it barely existed outside of his own heart. "I think I might know of a place that could use an artist like you," he said, his tone casual but his eyes sincere. "Give us a call when you're settled." The exchange was brief, but it was charged with a potential that dwarfed the failed encounter in the restaurant. Driving home, the car was filled with a comfortable, hopeful silence. Leo, humming softly, was already sketching a new picture in his book, a woman with a portfolio standing under a rain of colorful flowers. A new, unexpected bond had been formed, a testament to the fact that true connection is often found not in curated settings, but in the spontaneous, unscripted moments of human grace. The silence that Arthur and Leo left behind was heavier than any conversation had been, pressing down on Clara with an almost physical weight. She remained at the table, her hands clenched in her lap, replaying the encounter in her mind. A part of her felt a surge of righteous indignation. Who was he to stage such a manipulative test? Life was not a feel-good movie. It was hard. It was unforgiving, and she had learned long ago that you couldn't afford to take on someone else's burdens when you could barely carry your own. Yet, beneath the anger, a more unsettling feeling stirred. The memory of the boy's intelligent, curious eyes, which had dimmed at her words, pricked at her conscience. She saw the quiet, unshakable bond between father and son, a fortress of love she had just tried to breach with her bitterness. She shook her head, trying to banish the image. She was a survivor, and survivors didn't have the luxury of such sentiment. The clinking of silverware faded, replaced by the rhythmic, sterile beep of a heart monitor from a memory she kept locked away. She was 25 again, her world smelling of antiseptic and fear. She was holding the hand of her husband, Mark, a strong, vibrant man now rendered motionless in a hospital bed. A fall from a construction site had severed more than his spinal cord. It had severed the future they had so carefully planned. Through her tears, she had made him a solemn promise. She would be his legs, his strength, his unwavering partner through it all. She saw not a tragedy, but a challenge to be overcome by the sheer force of their love. In that moment, her compassion was a boundless ocean, her loyalty an unbreakable shield. She truly believed that their love was enough, that she could carry them both through the darkness and back into the light, no matter the cost. But promises are fragile things, and the weight of reality can be crushing. The following years became a blur of caregiver duties, menial jobs, and the slow, agonizing erosion of their shared spirit. The financial strain was a constant, suffocating presence, but the emotional toll was far worse. Mark's depression became a third person in their marriage, a bitter and resentful shadow that twisted his love into something unrecognizable. He began to see her tireless efforts not as acts of devotion, but as reminders of his own helplessness. The final blow came not with a bang, but with the quiet finality of a note left on the kitchen counter. He was gone. He wrote that he couldn't be a burden any longer, but she knew it was abandonment. He had left her with crippling debt, a young daughter to raise, and a heart shattered by the one person she had sacrificed everything for. The memory dissolved, leaving Clara sitting alone in the opulent restaurant, a ghost at her own table. That was the truth she never spoke of. Her cruel words to Arthur had not been aimed at a small, innocent boy. They were a visceral, panicked reaction to the ghost of her past. To her, a wheelchair wasn't just a piece of medical equipment. It was a symbol of broken vows, of financial ruin, of a love that had buckled and collapsed under pressure. She saw Arthur's quiet devotion not as noble, but as a naive prelude to the same inevitable heartbreak she had endured. Her question, so sharp and cold, was a projection of her own deep, unhealed wound, a bitter warning fired from the depths of her own trauma, aimed at a man who was unknowingly walking the very path that had led to her own ruin. Finally pushing herself up, Clara walked out into the cool, damp night, the city's indifferent lights reflecting on the wet pavement. She had to put the disastrous evening behind her and focus on what truly mattered: tomorrow. Tucked safely in her purse was a letter that represented her last, best hope, a final interview for a management position at a new, highly regarded charity. The job promised a salary that could change everything for her and her daughter, a chance to finally breathe. The organization was called the Leo's Light Foundation. A flicker of fierce determination ignited within her. This was it. This was the opportunity she would not, could not, squander. But what she couldn't possibly know was that the fate of her entire future now rested in the hands of the very man whose heart she had so carelessly judged. The following Monday, Clara walked through the gleaming glass doors of the Leo's Light Foundation headquarters with a heart full of fragile, desperate hope. She had spent the entire weekend preparing, ironing her best blouse until it was crisp, rehearsing answers to every conceivable question. This wasn't just an interview, it was a lifeline, the one tangible chance to pull herself and her daughter out of the quicksand of their circumstances. The lobby was a cathedral of modern design, filled with natural light and quiet purpose, a world away from her cramped, dimly lit apartment. An executive assistant with a kind but professional smile greeted her by name and led her down a hushed corridor. With every step on the plush carpet, Clara's pulse quickened. She was ready, she was qualified. She would not let this slip away from her grasp. The assistant stopped before a pair of large oak doors, opening one and gesturing for Clara to enter. The office was vast, with floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a breathtaking panorama of the city skyline. It was the office of a man who commanded worlds. But what seized Clara's attention was a magnificent painting on the far wall. It depicted a young boy in a wheelchair, not in a somber setting, but in a field where the flowers bloomed into constellations of light, a scene of vibrant, joyful imagination. A man stood with his back to her, gazing out at the city below, his silhouette powerful and still. The silence was thick with anticipation. The assistant's voice was a soft intrusion. "Sir," she said, "your final candidate has arrived." Slowly, deliberately, the figure at the window began to turn. It was Arthur. The world seemed to tilt and then freeze in a single, horrifying moment of recognition. The man from the restaurant, the father she had judged so harshly, stood before her, not as a blind date, but as the master of this new universe she so desperately wanted to enter. The quiet, knowing smile she had found so infuriating was back, but now it held no mystery. It was a look of profound, sorrowful understanding. Everything crashed into place with the force of a physical blow. The foundation's name, Leo's Light. The unconventional questions. The test. It hadn't been a date. It had been an audition for the soul. And she had delivered a monologue of bitterness and cruelty. The silence in the room became a roar in her ears, the sound of a door slamming shut on her future. Arthur's voice, when it came, was the same calm, measured tone she remembered. Yet it carried the weight of a final verdict. "Clara," he said, gesturing to an elegant chair across from his expansive desk, "thank you for coming." He didn't raise his voice. He didn't accuse. He didn't need to. He simply began to speak about the Foundation's core principles, about its unwavering commitment to families navigating profound challenges. He explained that technical skill and experience were important, but that the soul of the organization rested on something more fundamental: innate compassion. He spoke of the need for leaders who could see the humanity in others, especially when they believed no one was evaluating them. His words were a clinical, detached summary of the very test she had so spectacularly failed. Each syllable a nail in the coffin of her hopes. Hope, which had been a fragile flame just moments before, was extinguished, replaced by the icy chill of shame. It wasn't just a job she had lost. It was a future, the security for her daughter, the escape from her crushing debt, the chance to be part of something meaningful. All of it had been riding on a single moment of grace, and she had chosen cruelty instead. Her own past trauma, the ghost of her husband's abandonment, had become a self-fulfilling prophecy, making her lash out and destroy the very opportunity that could have healed her. She stared at Arthur, at the profound sadness in his eyes that was far worse than any anger, and understood. Her world had not simply been turned upside down, it had been irrevocably shattered by the echo of her own unkind words. The initial shock that had paralyzed Clara in her chair began to recede, replaced by a rising tide of cold, defensive anger. The grand office which had moments before symbolized a new beginning, now felt like an elaborate trap, a stage designed for her public humiliation. Arthur's calm, measured words continued to flow, detailing the Foundation's ethos of compassion and understanding, but she heard them as a series of thinly veiled accusations. Each syllable was a judgment, a confirmation of her failure. Her mind replayed the scene in the restaurant, her own sharp, dismissive words now echoing in the cavernous room like a confession she couldn't retract. Her pride, the hardened shield she had carried for years, began to rise, not to protect her from the world, but to protect her from the unbearable weight of her own actions. She would not be made to feel small. She would not crumble. "This isn't fair," she finally managed to say, her voice tight and brittle with a sense of profound injustice. "You tricked me. You set me up. That wasn't an interview. It was a personal test under false pretenses. How can you judge my professional capabilities based on a blind date?" Her words were an attempt to reframe the narrative, to cast herself as the victim of his unorthodox methods rather than the author of her own downfall. She looked at him, her eyes pleading for him to see the logic in her argument, to acknowledge the unfairness of the situation. She was a single mother fighting to survive, not a monster. She had simply been honest, worn down by a life that had taught her to be wary of any additional burdens. She was trying to protect herself, and now she was being punished for it. Arthur listened without interruption, his expression unchanging. His stillness was more unnerving than any outburst would have been. When she finished, he didn't respond to her accusations directly. Instead, his gaze shifted to a small, framed photograph on his desk, which he picked up with a gentle reverence. It showed Leo, beaming, holding up a lopsided clay pot he had clearly made himself. "The person I hire for this position," Arthur said, his voice quiet but carrying an immense weight, "will be responsible for the well-being of hundreds of families, of hundreds of children like Leo. They will have to make decisions that require a deep, instinctual well of empathy. It's not a quality that can be found on a resume, and it's not something that a person turns on and off depending on the situation. It's simply who they are." He placed the frame back down, his meaning devastatingly clear. The test wasn't about her. It was about the children she would have served. The last of her defenses crumbled under the quiet force of his conviction. The anger evaporated, leaving behind a vast, hollow emptiness. Shame, cold and sharp, pierced through her pride. For the first time, she saw the situation not from her own wounded perspective, but through his eyes. She had looked at his beloved, brilliant son and seen only a complication, an obstacle. The cruelty of her words, born from her own private pain, was now laid bare, stripped of all its justifications. Tears burned at the back of her eyes, but she fought them back with every ounce of her will. To cry now would be a final, pathetic admission of defeat. She felt the crushing weight of every bad decision, every bitter thought, every wall she had built around her heart. It was a prison of her own making, and she had just slammed the door shut on her only chance of escape. Arthur stood up, the movement fluid and decisive, a clear signal that their time was over. He didn't look at her with contempt or pity, but with a profound and final sadness that was somehow worse. It was the look of a man who had hoped for a different outcome and was deeply disappointed by the reality. "My assistant will show you out," he said, his tone polite and impersonal. A return to the formal roles of CEO and failed candidate. He turned his back to her, walking slowly to the vast window and gazing out at the city below. A silent, absolute dismissal. Clara was left standing alone in the middle of the room. Invisible, the silence was absolute, broken only by the sound of her own ragged breath. She had been rejected, not just for a job, but for the person she had become, leaving her to wonder if there was any way back from the ruin of her own heart. The heavy oak door began to swing shut, its quiet click poised to be the final, definitive sound of her failure. But Clara's hand, trembling, stopped its movement. She stood frozen in the doorway, caught between the anonymous corridor of her past and the vast, sunlit office that represented a future she had just forfeited. Turning slowly, she met Arthur's back, the powerful silhouette still framed against the cityscape. The last vestiges of her defensive pride crumbled away, leaving only a raw, desolate honesty. There was nothing left to lose. She had already been judged and dismissed, but she realized in that moment that this wasn't about the job anymore. It was about finding her way back to the person she was before the world had broken her, a person she barely recognized. She needed to speak the truth, not as an excuse, but as a confession. "My husband," she began, her voice barely a whisper, yet it carried across the silent room with startling clarity. Arthur turned from the window, his expression unreadable. His name was Mark. He had an accident, a fall. He was paralyzed from the waist down. "Just a year after we were married." The words tumbled out, a story she had kept locked away for nearly a decade. She spoke of the promises made in a sterile hospital room, the grueling years of caregiving, and the slow, corrosive effect it had on their love until it curdled into resentment and despair. "When I looked at your son in that restaurant," she confessed, tears now streaming unchecked down her face, "I didn't see a child. I saw a ghost. I saw the beginning of the story that ruined my life, and I was cruel because I was terrified. You weren't the only one testing someone that night." Arthur walked slowly from the window, closing the vast distance between them until he stood just a few feet away. The judgment in his eyes had dissolved, replaced by a deep, resonant empathy that was more powerful than any words of forgiveness. He saw past the bitter woman in the restaurant and the failed candidate in his office, and for the first time, he saw the terrified young widow who had been left to fight the world alone. He recognized the armor she wore because he had forged a similar one for himself after his wife had passed away, leaving him to raise Leo. He understood that her cruelty was not a reflection of her soul, but a scar left by a wound that had never been allowed to properly heal. He had been looking for compassion, but he had forgotten that sometimes it is buried under layers of profound pain. "Clara," he said, his voice gentle, breaking the fragile silence. "The Leo's Light Foundation isn't run by people who have never been broken. It's run by people who know, intimately, what it's like to need help. It's for people who understand that strength isn't about never falling. It's about how you get back up." He paused, his gaze unwavering. "Your experience doesn't disqualify you. In fact, it might be your single greatest qualification. You understand the fear and the exhaustion of the families we serve in a way no one else on my team ever could." He extended his hand, not for a handshake to dismiss her, but as an invitation. "The position is still open. If you want it, it's yours." It wasn't an act of pity. It was an act of profound understanding, a recognition of her true, hidden character. A wave of disbelief, followed by a surge of overwhelming gratitude, washed over Clara. For the first time in years, she felt seen, not for her struggles or her flaws, but for the strength it took to survive them. She took his hand, her grip firm, sealing a pact that was about more than just employment. It was about redemption. As the afternoon sun streamed through the window, casting long, warm shafts of light across the office, the heavy atmosphere of judgment lifted, replaced by a quiet sense of hope and reconciliation. The walls she had built around her heart began to dissolve in that golden light. The world outside the window seemed brighter, no longer a landscape of threats and obstacles, but one of possibility. A new chapter had begun, born not from a perfect interview, but from a moment of raw, painful, and ultimately healing truth. 6 months later, the world looked different, painted in hues of hope that Clara had long forgotten existed. Her office at the Leo's Light Foundation wasn't just a workspace. It was a sanctuary where her past pain was transmuted into purpose. She moved through the halls, not with the brittle defensiveness of a survivor, but with the quiet, confident grace of a healer. Today, she sat with a young mother whose husband had just received a difficult diagnosis, listening not just to the words, but to the terrified silence between them. Clara didn't offer platitudes or empty reassurances. Instead, she shared a small, honest piece of her own story, creating a bridge of shared experience. In her voice, the other woman found not pity, but a profound, resonant understanding. Clara had discovered that her deepest wound had become her most powerful gift, allowing her to see the person behind the problem every single time. The weekends were now filled with a gentle rhythm of shared laughter and quiet companionship. This Saturday, a warm afternoon sun spilled across a sprawling public park, where the three of them had become a familiar sight. Arthur pushed Leo's wheelchair along a path lined with blossoming cherry trees, while Clara walked beside them, pointing out the shapes of animals in the clouds. Leo, more vibrant and outgoing than ever, was directing the entire adventure. His sketchbook filled with heroic portraits of Clara as a knight and his father as a friendly dragon. There was no pretense, no awkwardness, just the easy, comfortable silence of people who had found a home in one another's presence. They were not a conventional family, but they were something far more precious, a small constellation of souls who had chosen to navigate the darkness together, guided by the light of mutual kindness and respect. It's a profound truth of the human journey that our greatest detours often lead us to our most essential destinations. Clara had once believed her life was a series of wrong turns and dead ends, a map of failures leading nowhere. Yet, the very moment that felt like her ultimate ruin, that disastrous, humiliating night at the restaurant, had been the start of her true path. For it is often in our deepest wounds that the seeds of our greatest strengths are planted. Character is not forged in the absence of mistakes, but in the fierce, humble courage it takes to face them, to own them, and to allow them to break you open into a better, more compassionate version of yourself. What had looked like a closed door for Clara was, in fact, the only entrance to the life that was truly meant for her. The ripples of a single act of understanding can travel farther than we can ever imagine, touching shores we will never see. Arthur's choice to look beyond Clara's scar to see her story is a quiet reminder that everyone is fighting a battle we know nothing about. In a world so quick to judge, the greatest rebellion is to offer a second chance, to believe in the possibility of redemption that exists within every heart. If this story of an unexpected connection and the healing power of empathy has touched your own heart, perhaps it is a story that is meant to be shared. For in sharing these reminders of our shared humanity, we help illuminate the path for others who may be lost, helping them find their own way back to the light. As the afternoon sun dipped toward the horizon, casting a long, golden glow across the park, Leo held up his latest masterpiece. It was a drawing of the three of them, not just standing together, but with their hands linked, forming a circle. Above their heads, he had drawn a brilliant, smiling sun whose rays were made of colorful flowers. Arthur and Clara looked at the drawing, then at each other, and a silent, profound understanding passed between them. It was a look that acknowledged the pain of the past, the peace of the present, and the quiet, hopeful promise of the future. In that shared gaze, surrounded by the warmth of the fading light and the pure, unconditional love of a child, they had found their resolution. It wasn't a fairy tale ending, but something far more real and beautiful, a lasting peace.